everyone, it's John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn lesson on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War, 1941 to 1942. Okay, so we're going all the way to the Far East for this next edition of the World War II series. So we're going to start by looking at the context and the causes. So what actually drove the Japanese to attack at Pearl Harbor in the first place, because it was a tremendous strategic risk that they were taking here. Then we will look at a really good chronology, so we'll get a feel for that and kind of really help you beef up your history notes in your books. We'll look at a big turning point as well in the Pacific War, and then we'll look at the wider impact and historical significance of the Pearl Harbor attacks. Okay, so let's dive in, everyone. So first off, the context and the causes. What was driving the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor in the first place? Well, first off then, we would have Japanese expansion, and they were trying to create something called the Greater East Asian Japanese Co-Prosperity Sphere. Okay, basically it was an imperial domination over Asia to secure raw materials for the Japanese economy and to eliminate Western colonial influence. Okay, so that's what they were trying to achieve. And to be fair, the Japanese Navy was extremely powerful, as you can kind of see. Great air force, and the battleships were among the best in the world. These were tough. They were very, very tough and well positioned here. And the Japanese were also embroiled in the Second Sino-Japanese War. So basically, that was a brutal military expansion into China, and it was draining their resources, and it was also isolating Japan diplomatically. So they were kind of worried about that, and they had to kind of come up with a plan to break out of the Chinese kind of quagmire. Second thing that was driving the Pearl Harbor attacks, in my analysis, would be economic embargoes and resource crises. So the Americans had put a steel and oil embargo on the Japanese, basically freezing them, and they couldn't import those strategic materials. So Washington froze Japanese assets and cut off around about 80% of Japan's oil imports after its move into Indochina, because America didn't like Japan kind of stamping around East Asia and kind of conquering places. So they're trying to cripple the Japanese economy. Now that set in the Japanese High Command, that set a kind of resource clock ticking, because basically the Japanese Navy especially, they would face naval paralysis within 2 years. They would run out of strategic stocks of oil especially if they just sat and did nothing. So the clock was ticking. So Tokyo decided to seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies and Malaya, where they could get easy access to oil. And that only made things worse, because obviously the Americans started to get very, very annoyed with that. So anyway, this kind of strategic standoff kind of happened and was kind of carrying on for a while, until Japan was like, well, if we keep going like this, we're going to get choked off economically. So what are we going to do? So the strategic calculations and preemptive strike. So the US Pacific Fleet posed a massive threat to any Japanese expansion, as we know. The Japanese military leaders believed that the American fleet at Pearl Harbor was the only force capable of stopping their southern expansion into the resource-rich areas of Southeast Asia, where they could steal all the oil and all the resources and rubber especially that they needed to keep their military machine running. So Admiral Yamamoto, who's in the image there, who's probably Japan's best strategic planner in this period, planned a decisive preemptive carrier strike to basically knock out the US Pacific Fleet and buy enough time for the Japanese to conquer all of Southeast Asia, or what they needed, and then force a negotiated peace. Okay, it was a big part of Japanese strategic culture. They believed in a word called kessen, which was a decisive battle, almost like a samurai sword. Just strike at the enemy once, knock them down, and then you've won the war. It was a big part of how the Japanese thought in this kind of area. So that was where the Pearl Harbor attack kind of came from, and the idea and the concept for it. So now we understand why the Japanese were kind of gunning for this. Let's see what happened at Pearl Harbor and then in the Pacific War in the first year or two. So this is great for your notes. So first off then, 7th of September 1941, a date that will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt said. The attack on Pearl Harbor, as you can see in that very famous image. So there was a surprise carrier raid. So 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 planes in 2 waves against the US naval base in Oahu, Hawaii. So basically they launched it towards Pearl Harbor and they approached secretively. So Battleship Row was devastated. So 4 US battleships were sunk, including the USS Arizona, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and it killed almost 2,500 Americans. So this was a big deal. This was a surprise attack as well. Very, very sneaky, went against the rules of war. The crucial escape, though, all 3 US Pacific aircraft carriers were out at sea during the attack and completely undamaged. So that was a real problem because they are the nucleus of US sea and air power in this period, and the Japanese would have loved to have sank all of those, but sadly for them, they didn't. Luckily they were out at sea. Then after the Pearl Harbor attack then, so December 1941 to May 1942, the Japanese kind of run riot. They kind of expand everywhere. So the fall of Malaya and Singapore for the British in February 1942, and you can see in that image, basically that is the surrender of the British to the Japanese in Singapore. So Singapore surrenders, and it results in the capture of 80,000 Commonwealth troops who endure horrible conditions in prisoner of war camps in Asia. The fall of the Philippines, 1942, May. US and Filipino forces surrendered at Corregidor, followed by the brutal Bataan Death March, where again a lot of prisoners died. The Japanese were merciless with their prisoners because they believed in the samurai Bushido code, and they believed that if you surrendered, you were weak and you were, not really worth much in terms of on a human level. So they worked their prisoners to death sometimes. It was horrendous. And they secured southern resources. So Japan rapidly overrun Hong Kong, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, seizing vital rubber and oil reserves. So to keep the Japanese war machine going. So they are on an absolute rampage here. Then in May 1942, though, things start to kind of shift a little bit. So you have the Battle of the Coral Sea. So that's the first pure carrier duel in the Pacific. Opposing naval surface fleets didn't actually see each other. They fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft without ever seeing each other. So that was a big naval kind of innovation, really, using air power at sea. Halting the advance, so although it was tactically costly for the US, they lost the USS Lexington. It successfully blocked the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, which was just to the north of Australia. So they fought really hard and they just about held the Japanese off. And they were shielding Australia. So you can see in that propaganda poster there, they were very worried about the Japanese actually invading Australia, which sounds outlandish, but they were worried about it. And that the blunting of Papua New Guinea invasion prevented Japanese isolation of Australia, and it also depleted Japanese frontline carrier strength ahead of the Battle of Midway. Okay, so they start to kind of blunt the Japanese assaults, which was good. Then we have 4th to the 7th of June 1942. We have a very famous carrier battle here, the Battle of Midway. Okay, and you can see a really interesting image there. So there was a code-breaking triumph. So the US Naval Intelligence at Station HYPO cracked the Japanese naval code, which was massive. So you can basically read all the Japanese movements of their fleet. And that enabled them to ambush an invasion fleet which was sailing towards the island of Midway. So the fatal 5 minutes, so Douglas Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese flight decks and they sank all 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu. Okay, and those were priceless for the Japanese. Once you sink them, aircraft carriers would take that long to build, you're not building anymore. Okay, so it was very, very difficult. Once they lost those carriers, almost impossible to replace. And it was a strategic pivot. So the Battle of Midway ended Japan's naval offensive capacity. They just didn't have the capacity now to attack you formally, and permanently shifted the initiative in the Pacific to the United States. Okay, it's no accident why the Japanese, they imposed a media censorship on the Battle of Midway, so the Japanese public didn't even know that they'd been defeated. They thought they'd actually won the Battle of Midway for quite a number of months. It was because the Japanese were trying to get their head around such a naval defeat and how to deal with it. Okay, so that kind of clips the Japanese wings, if I can put it that way. And the turning point is, well, I'm sure you can pretty much work out. I think the turning point in this period of the Pacific War was the Battle of Midway and the code breaking in June 1942. So the Battle of Midway was a loss of irreplaceable naval assets for the Japanese. It destroyed 4 veteran Japanese fleet carriers, and hundreds of elite naval aviators were shot out of the air, and they couldn't be replaced. It just takes hundreds of hours to train these elite pilots, and you can see for visual learners a little bit of a visual representation. Kind of bomb. Japanese aircraft. They couldn't be replaced, so it was very, very difficult for them. So there's a permanent balance shift now. It transfers naval air supremacy to the US Navy, and it put Japan permanently on the back foot now in the Pacific. They're going to struggle now. They're on the defensive. Okay. So with that in mind then, what was the impact and significance of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific War? Well, tertiary significance, secondary significance, and primary significance. Let's have a look and disentangle some of them. So in our mind, I think the tertiary significance was the collapse initially of Western imperial prestige. In this era in Asia, there was a lot of racism, and the white race, if I can put it that way, believed themselves to be stronger than Asians, and that's what they almost believed. However, the Japanese turned that on its head because they were conquering kind of Britain, weren't they? So the fall of Singapore was a humiliating defeat, and it shattered the myth of European colonial invulnerability across Southeast Asia, because the white British now were not this kind of master race who kind of lorded it over everybody in Asia. They were shown to be vulnerable. And that led to kind of nationalist leaders such as Chandra Bose there, which you can see in the image. He was an Indian leader who wanted to boot the British out of India. And it also led to a post-war nationalism. So the Japanese wartime occupation unintentionally ignited anti-colonial and nationalist movements across Asia, which were then, led to decolonization after the war. Then secondary significance, so we're getting a little bit more important now. It was a revolution in naval warfare, so it showed the supremacy of the aircraft carrier, very important, and it made the traditional battleship kind of obsolete now, because you can just send your bombers to blow it up, and the bombers fly on the carriers. So it established naval air power as a decisive factor at sea. It was absolutely critical. And it established as well an industrial war of attrition. So it unleashed the overwhelming industrial capacity of the US mainland now against Japan, which Japan could never match. You just need to look at a map. Japan is tiny, America is massive. You're not going to win. It's as simple as that. You're just on a countdown now to defeat, in my mind, in terms of industrial warfare. And then in terms of primary significance then, I think it was the entry of the United States into the war, and it ended US isolationism. So it's no accident that Churchill said, after Pearl Harbor, he went to sleep and slept soundly. It's because he knew that with America at your side, you're not going to lose the war now, that you're too strong. So Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech unified public opinion, and it brought America fully into the global war now. They are going to fight now right to the end. You can see the American Navy was absolutely very, very strong. And it was only ever going to get stronger because they had such a big shipbuilding capacity, and that's going to push back the Japanese over time. And in terms of primary significance, again, still, it now becomes a truly global war. So the Grand Alliance is formed between USA, Great Britain, and USSR, and they start to have a policy. They do push in the Pacific, that's very important, but America adopts the strategic policy of Germany first because they saw Hitler as the worst or the trickiest opponent, so they wanted to knock him out first. But America was so vast in this period and so powerful, they had two wars at the same time. They put most of the resources into defeating Germany first, but they still said no, we'll attack Japan at the same time, and we'll have two wars fighting at the same time because America was so powerful in this period. So there you go. That is Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific War. Okay, and that hopefully gives you a good framework for understanding what was happening in this period, and then you can obviously jump off now into your own independent research. So it just remains to say, really, as always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another Let's Learn video again. Keep your eyes peeled as well for the next video in the World War II series. If you have any comments and stuff that you want to pop in about the Pacific War, just pop those into the comments box, and we'll always do our best to reply. So it just remains to say that's been a pleasure. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. Take care, and we'll see you soon.